Are you ready to uncover the hidden truths that have been buried beneath the surface? Prepare yourself for a journey into the unsettling depths of history as we unveil 5 shocking facts about the Black African slave breeding they won't tell you. What if we told you that there is a side of this transatlantic slave trade that textbooks conveniently leave out? Brace yourself as we challenge the sanitized narratives and delve into the dark reality of systematic exploitation, human commodification, and intergenerational trauma inflicted upon Black African slaves. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew as we shed light on the silenced stories, amplify the voices that history has ignored, and strive for a deeper understanding of the haunting legacy of Black African slave breeding. Fact number 1 revealed the systematic exploitation of Black African slaves through breeding programs. Let's delve into the horrifying reality of how enslaved individuals were treated as mere commodities for reproduction. Slave breeding was a deliberate and calculated strategy employed by slave owners and traders to increase their profits. Enslaved men and women were selected and coerced into reproducing to produce more enslaved individuals who would be sold or used as laborers. Imagine the cold-hearted calculations made by the slave owners, viewing human beings as nothing more than objects to generate profit. Enslaved individuals had no say in their reproductive choices. Their bodies were treated as instruments solely for the purpose of breeding more slaves, perpetuating a cycle of dehumanization and economic gain. Slave owners regarded enslaved individuals as nothing more than breeding stock, devoid of their humanity and autonomy. Their intimate relationships were manipulated and controlled, with no regard for their emotional well-being or familial ties. They were forced to mate based on the financial interests of their owners, often resulting in severe psychological trauma and the destruction of family structures. Can you imagine the profound emotional trauma inflicted upon enslaved individuals when their most intimate relationships were reduced to tools for financial gain? Love, connection, and the ability to choose a partner were stripped away, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered families. This systematic dehumanization left deep emotional scars that would persist for generations to come. The dehumanization inherent in slave breeding reduced Black African individuals to mere objects, stripped of their agency and dignity. Their bodies were treated as commodities to be bought and sold and exploited, perpetuating a cycle of suffering for generations to come. Enslaved individuals were robbed of their agency and basic human rights. They were denied the fundamental freedom to make choices about their bodies and their lives. Instead, they were subjected to the whims of their owners, treated as commodities to be bought, sold, and bred like livestock. This dehumanization had profound and long-lasting effects, not just on the individuals themselves, but on the collective consciousness of Black African communities. Fact number 2 sheds light on the heart-wrenching separation and loss experienced by enslaved individuals due to slave breeding practices. Let's explore the devastating impact of tearing families apart. Enslaved men and women were forcibly separated from their partners and children, with no regard for the deep emotional bonds that they had formed. The relentless pursuit of profits from breeding led to the sale or the relocation of individuals, leaving families torn apart and forever scarred. The separation of enslaved families was a deliberate and cruel tactic used by slave owners to maintain control and maximize profits. Husbands torn from their wives, mothers torn from their children, these heart-wrenching separations inflicted immeasurable pain and left lasting emotional scars. Enslaved individuals endured the anguish of not knowing whether they would ever see their loved ones again. Children born from the forced unions were often taken away from their mothers at an early age, further exacerbating the trauma and robbing them of their sense of identity and belonging. The loss of family connections inflicted profound emotional pain and created a generational cycle of disconnection and longing. Imagine the anguish of enslaved mothers whose newborn infants were ripped from their arms, their maternal bonds severed with callous disregard. These innocent children grew up without the nurturing love of their mothers, denied the opportunity to experience the warmth of a family. The loss of familial connections not only shattered individuals' lives, but also eroded the very fabric of the enslaved community, leaving a void that would reverberate for generations. The intentional destruction of family units not only caused immense suffering, but also served as a strategy to weaken the social fabric of enslaved communities. By eroding familial bonds, slave owners sought to undermine resistance and maintain control over a traumatized and a fragmented population. Fact number 3 uncovers the disturbing truth about selective breeding and eugenics in the context of Black African slave breeding. Let's delve into the dehumanizing ideologies that justify these reprehensible practices. Slave breeding often involved the selective pairing of enslaved individuals based on perceived desirable traits such as physical strength, intelligence, or specific skills. This degrading practice drew upon pseudo-scientific ideas of racial superiority and sought to create a subjugated population tailored to the needs and preferences of the enslavers. Enslaved individuals were treated as objects to be manipulated and controlled for the benefit of their owners. They were evaluated based on superficial and erroneous notions of racial superiority, with some deemed more valuable than others based on their physical attributes or perceived abilities. This dehumanizing practice further entrenched racist ideologies and reinforced the belief in the supposed superiority of the enslavers. Enslaved individuals were subjected to physical examinations and evaluations akin to livestock to determine their breeding potential. Those deemed desirable were coerced into reproducing with other selected individuals, perpetuating the belief in racial hierarchies and reinforcing the notion that certain traits were inherently superior or inferior based on race. The pseudoscientific concept of eugenics played a significant role in justifying and perpetuating selective breeding practices. Enslaved individuals were treated as objects to be bred and controlled, their worth determined solely by their perceived genetic qualities. These dehumanizing ideologies perpetuated the notion of racial hierarchy and served to legitimize the exploitation and subjugation of black African slaves. The practice of selective breeding and eugenics not only aimed to create a subservient labor force, but also sought to erode the sense of self-worth and humanity of the enslaved population. By deeming certain individuals as inherently inferior or unworthy, slave owners and proponents of eugenics attempted to justify their actions and maintain their own sense of superiority. Fact number 4 sheds light on the specific exploitation of black women's bodies within the context of slave breeding. Let's uncover the harrowing experiences faced by black women who were subjected to this form of dehumanization. Black women endured unimaginable physical and sexual exploitation as a result of slave breeding practices. They were treated as objects of reproduction, with their bodies violated and their reproductive capacities controlled and exploited by slave owners. The reproductive capabilities of black women were seen as valuable commodities within the institution of slavery. They were subjected to the relentless pressure to bear children, often at the expense of their own health and well-being. Their bodies were used as tools for the production of more enslaved individuals, perpetuating a system of human bondage and economic gain. Black women faced the dual burden of forced labor and forced reproduction, enduring back-breaking work in the fields while also being subjected to the sexual demands of their owners. They were denied the basic right to autonomy over their bodies and reproductive choices, further reinforcing the dehumanization they experienced. The sexual exploitation of black women was a horrifying aspect of slave breeding. Their bodies were violated, their consent ignored, and their reproductive choices disregarded. They were seen as property to be used and discarded at the whim of their owners, leaving lasting physical and emotional scars. The exploitation of black women's bodies extended beyond reproductive coercion. They were often subjected to the brutal practice of breeding contests and slave mating, where they were forced to engage in sexual acts with the selected male slaves, further objectifying and degrading them. The practice of breeding contests reduced black women to mere objects of sexual gratification, reinforcing the notion that their bodies existed solely for the pleasure and profit of others. This form of sexual exploitation not only dehumanized black women but also created an environment of competition and humiliation among the enslaved population. Fact number 5 uncovers the long-lasting effects of intergenerational trauma stemming from black African slave breeding. Let's examine how the horrors of this practice continue to reverberate through subsequent generations. The trauma inflicted upon enslaved individuals through slave breeding was not confined to their own lifetimes. It permeated through families and communities, leaving a legacy of pain, disconnection, and psychological distress that had been carried forward for centuries. The constant separation, loss, and dehumanization experienced by enslaved individuals had profound effects on their mental and emotional well-being. The trauma they endured were passed down through generations as the scars of slavery imprinted themselves on the collective psyche of black African communities. The weight of this intergenerational trauma continues to be felt today. The effects of intergenerational trauma manifest in various ways, including high levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and even physical health disparities within black African communities. The psychological wounds inflicted by slave breeding have left a lasting impact on the mental and emotional health of individuals and their descendants. Studies have shown that the traumatic experiences of one's ancestors can be transmitted epigenetically, impacting gene expression and influencing the susceptibility to mental and physical health conditions. This highlights the long-term consequences of slave breeding not just on individuals who directly experienced it, but also on subsequent generations who carry the burden of their ancestors' pain. Recognizing and addressing intergenerational trauma is crucial for healing and reconciliation. It requires acknowledging the historical and ongoing impact of slave breeding on Black African communities and working towards creating spaces for healing, empowerment, and resilience. Understanding the intergenerational trauma resulting from Black African slave breeding provides an important lens through which we can comprehend the persistent disparities and challenges faced by the Black communities today. In conclusion, delving into the hidden truths surrounding Black African slave breeding reveals the horrifying reality of this dark period in history. The systematic exploitation, separation, selective breeding, and intergenerational trauma inflicted upon enslaved individuals leaves an indelible mark on our collective conscience. It is imperative that we acknowledge and confront these painful truths, ensuring that the voices and experiences of those affected are heard and validated. By understanding the profound impact of slave breeding, we are compelled to actively work towards justice, equality, and healing, dismantling the legacies of oppression that continue to affect Black African communities. Only by facing the uncomfortable realities of our past can we pave the way for a more inclusive and compassionate future, one that upholds the dignity and humanity of every individual.